Okay, so today we are going to talk about the cardiovascular system, and we're going to start out talking about blood vessels. Now, before I really get into that, let me just kind of give an overview here, because when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the organ system that gives us the ability to move blood throughout the body. Now, blood is carrying oxygen, and it's carrying our nutrients, and it carries things like hormones. So it's a carrying system, okay? And it goes to all of the cells in the body. So we're going to start out at the heart, and the heart is our pump. This is what's moving the blood around. It's kind of like, you know, your hose at home. You turn on that faucet or that spigot, and there's pressure that comes out, and the blood is able to move around. So the water is able to move through the hose. Now, the hosing systems that we have in the body start out after the heart. We go into tubes or hoses that are called the arteries. And the largest of those arteries that come straight off the heart, and we're going to talk about this, is the aorta. So the aorta is the first hose or the first tube that the blood gets pumped through. And then the aorta divides. And it divides into arteries. So each of those arteries are a little bit smaller than the aorta, and then those arteries divide, and then those arteries divide, and every time they divide, they get smaller and smaller. And what they're doing when they're dividing is going to different areas, different organs of the body. Now, eventually, those arteries are going to divide enough that they end up going into little tubes we call arterioles. And this is still part of what would be referred to as the arterial system. But from the arterioles, then we leave that arterial system and we go into what are called capillaries. Now, capillaries are really, really tiny, tiny tubes, and I'll show you some pictures of all of these as we go through. But capillaries is, they're so tiny and they're so thin. They're really thin. This is where any of those nutrients we talked about, or oxygen, or anything that our organs, our tissues need, they're able to diffuse or move right out of those capillaries because the walls are so thin. And then, of course, capillaries also can pick up waste products from the organs, from the tissues in the system. So you have diffusion out, you have diffusion in, but that only happens in capillaries. It doesn't happen in arteries or even in arterioles. Now, from the capillaries, we're going to go into what are called venules. And then from the venules, we're going to go into veins. Now, the opposite is happening here, because now the blood is not traveling away from the heart, it's actually traveling towards the heart. And we're going from these really teeny tiny tubes that are super duper thin to now we're kind of bringing the tubes together. These tubes are now doing what we call coalescing, and they're coming together, forming a little bit bigger tube again. And now these tubes, although they are still kind of small, start to come together again to form veins. And then these veins take the blood back to the heart. So the venules and the veins are what we would call the venous system. And they are bringing blood back to the heart. So arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. And then veins, they're always carrying blood to the heart or towards the heart. Okay? So these are all the different blood vessels that help to circulate the blood through the system. So let's look at the differences between arteries, veins, and capillaries, besides the fact that arteries are taking blood away from the heart and veins are taking blood towards the heart. Okay? So if you look at the overhead just for a second, you can see on the left-hand side here, this is an artery, and then on the right-hand side we have a vein, and then in between the two we have some capillaries. Okay? So there's a couple of things different between arteries and veins, and for good reason. So let's talk about that. So we have arteries, oops, not a good pen. We have arteries versus veins. Okay? And still not a good pen. Running out of ink here. Alright, so an artery, number one. Oops, can't find any good pens. We'll just do this in black so we can see this. So, let me start out again. So arteries and veins have some differences, but they also have some similarities too. They both have 3 layers. Now when I talk about arteries and I talk about veins, really what I mean is these could be arteries or arterioles, so the arterial system. And when I say veins, it could be veins or venules, so the venous system. So both have 3 layers. So layer number 1, the innermost layer, and this lines the lumen, or the hole in the vessel. And what we call this innermost layer is the endothelial layer. So this is the innermost layer that the blood is going to come in contact with, and this is the endothelial layer. Now, several things we need to talk about the endothelial layer. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but we did kind of talk about this a little bit on day 1 of class. So the endothelial layer is super duper smooth. Smoother than anything. Nothing sticks to this layer, which is a really good thing. Because if this layer were sticky at all, your blood would start sticking to it. And other chemicals that float around in the blood would start sticking to it. And then eventually what you get is a blood clot. And that is absolutely not good, not acceptable. We don't want blood clots. This can cause some serious damage to the body because you don't get good blood flow, you can't carry oxygen, can't carry nutrients, things are going to die, okay? And that's basically what a stroke is. Not necessarily a blood clot, but anything that prevents oxygen from getting to the brain, and blood clots might be one of those things that can prevent it. So this lining, it lines the inside of all of our blood vessels. By the way, it also lines the inside of capillaries. It also lines the inside of the heart as well. So this is the endothelial super smooth lining. Now the next lining is the middle lining, and this is in, of course, both arteries and veins. And so this is the middle layer. And this is called the myo. I guess we want to call it differently. All right, so let's start this again. So this is the middle layer, and the endothelial lining, I forgot to tell you this, it can also be called the tunica intima. And so the middle layer is the tunica media. Now, what is really more important is that this is a muscle layer. So the tunica media is actually made of smooth muscle. Now, we've talked about skeletal muscle, and we talked about the fact the somatic nervous system allows us to have voluntary control, okay, of skeletal muscle. But smooth muscle is different. This is actually controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And do you remember what the autonomic nervous system is all about? Right, okay, so parasympathetic and sympathetic, and it's involuntary. So we don't think about this when the smooth muscle is controlled. This is involuntary. But this smooth muscle can constrict. It can contract. So now imagine you've got an artery or a vein with a lumen, a hole in the middle, and this muscle contracts. What will happen is the lumen gets smaller. When this muscle relaxes, the lumen gets bigger. This change in the diameter, the size of this lumen, will help to control our blood pressure. Or you could say it helps to control how fast or how slow the blood is flowing through the blood vessels. Now, the ability to make the lumen smaller is what we would call vasoconstriction. Let me just write that here. Vasoconstriction. Okay? And when something can vasoconstrict, it gets smaller. So if it gets bigger, we would say it will vasodilate. So that's what getting bigger is vasodilation. So vasoconstriction, smaller, vasodilation, larger lumen. Okay? Now, arteries will have much more smooth muscle than veins, which means arteries can vasoconstrict and vasodilate a heck of a lot better than veins. Veins are kind of wimpy, they don't have very much smooth muscle, they can't do a lot of constriction, and so that also means that arteries help to do the major part of control of our blood pressure, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so this middle layer is all about vasoconstriction, vasodilation, due to that smooth muscle, and that helps to control blood pressure. The very last outermost layer, okay, is the tunica externa. This layer, not super important. It's just kind of the covering layer made out of a lot of connective tissue. All it does is just sort of cover and protect the outside of the arteries, the veins, and even capillaries in this case has a tunica externa. Capillaries, they have a tunica intima and they have a tunica externa, but they don't have the media. They don't have any smooth muscle. So that's the difference between an artery, a vein, and then even a capillary. Now, one other thing that is very different between arteries and veins. So number one, we talked about the fact that arteries and veins, they have all three layers, but a difference. Arteries have more smooth muscle. The other difference is that veins have what we call valves. Okay? So if you look again at this overhead here, you'll see this right here, this is a valve. And veins have these valves, but arteries do not. And so this is a really, really big deal. So the heart, remember we talked about the fact it's your faucet. You turn it on or it pumps, it squeezes, and the blood squeezes out into the arteries. Now, as that blood is being forced out, the blood is coming out with pressure, just like your hose, the water comes out with pressure, and the blood starts moving through the system. Now, if you've got a hose, and you're shooting that hose through this super duper duper long tube, so it's a long, long hose. Maybe instead of a 100-foot hose, you have a 500-foot hose, okay? Is the water at the end of a 500-foot hose going to come out with as much pressure as the water at a 100-foot hose? Or even, let's say this, is the water at a 500-foot hose going to come out with as much pressure as the water at a 10-foot hose? Yeah, exactly. The 10-foot hose is going to have way more pressure than the 500-foot hose. As a matter of fact, at the end of the 500-foot hose, there might be just like a little trickle of water. So imagine that the arteries, arterioles, the capillaries, they're all attached to each other. They are kind of sort of like the 500-foot hose. Because by the time our heart has squeezed and pushed that blood through all those arteries, all those thousands of arterioles, and hundreds of thousands of capillaries, by the time the blood starts coming out the end of the capillary, it's barely moving. It's barely trickling. And it's moving so slow, and it has such little pressure that there's actually not enough pressure to force it back to the heart. So you only have enough oomph from the heart to actually push the blood out the arteries, out the arterioles, out the capillaries, but not through the veins. The blood just moves into the veins and basically it stops. Now, of course, needless to say, you and I were not dead. So somehow that blood has to get back through the venous system and back through the heart. And that's what those veins are all about. So let's look at this picture. Give me a second. I'll move it over here. And so now you can see in this picture here, here is the vein right down the middle. And then notice on either side of the vein is a muscle. And then inside the vein, of course, all veins, they have these valves. Now, here's what happens. The muscle, any muscle, it could be the muscle of the heart, cardiac muscle. It could be smooth muscle, which we just talked about is around blood vessels. But we also have smooth muscle that is in our gastrointestinal system, helps to move all our intestines around. And then, of course, skeletal muscle, which we have tons of that, okay? Doesn't matter what kind of muscle. This muscle is always going to be around a vein. Veins are always sandwiched in between muscle. So that every time muscle squeezes, every time muscle contracts, it actually squeezes on a vein and pops open that valve. And what it does is it squeezes blood upward through the body. It's almost like you're milking the blood upward as our muscles move. So every time you move muscles, you're actually squeezing veins and it's pushing the blood up to the heart, or whichever way to the heart. And so then you have these valves in the middle of these veins, and when the muscle squeezes, the valves pop open. Now when the muscle relaxes, the valve closes. And what that does is it prevents the blood from falling back down into the area it just came from. So the blood is moving up, you pop open the valve, and then when the muscle stops contracting, the valve closes so the blood can't go down. So those valves are super duper important. And of course the muscles are squeezing the blood back to the heart. So now let me ask you this question. What if I have a person who is quadriplegic? That means they're paralyzed from the neck down. Their muscles don't move. How does blood get back to the heart? Tough one, huh? Well, okay, so think about this. If they're paralyzed from the neck down, is that every single muscle in the body? No. So remember, you have cardiac muscle, you have smooth muscle, you have skeletal muscle. Those are three types of muscle. So when somebody's paralyzed from the neck down, the only thing that's paralyzed is the skeletal muscle. You still have all that smooth muscle that's churning the guts all day long, never stops. And then of course you have cardiac muscle that is constantly beating. Now that's not very much muscle, mind you. So there's not real good blood flow to the heart. The veins can't return very much blood to the heart, which is also one of the reasons why people who are quadriplegic, they have a tendency not to have really good muscles in the arms, not really good muscles in the legs, because they don't get a lot of good blood flow. They barely get enough blood flow to the internal organs and to the brain. And so you all, when you're working in the medical field, you give them physical therapy and you do different things to help to stimulate that muscle flow, because most of us, those of us who are not quadriplegic, we have our skeletal muscle that helps to squeeze on these arteries, and, or excuse me, squeeze on these veins and return that blood to the heart. And by the way, I want you to know, any blood that's going towards the heart that's being squeezed by muscle can also be called venous return. Okay? So venous return is the blood returning to the heart from the venous system or from the veins. Any questions so far? Okay, so then we're going to move on. And I want you to know that there are two major, what we would call circuits, kind of parts to the blood flow system. So let me erase a couple things here. And we'll talk about those. Okay, so again, we have the heart, okay? And we know that blood is leaving the heart, but one of the first things you have to know is that the heart is going to send blood to a couple different regions of the body. So one region that blood is going to go to is what we would call the pulmonary circuit. This would be a Y. And then another major region is the systemic circuit. So pulmonary is lungs. Systemic is the whole body. Now, we can break the whole body into parts, okay? So this could also be like the brain, and so this would be cerebral. So this is cerebral blood flow. Or you might have the heart, and so that's cardiac blood flow. And then the rest of the body would simply usually be called systemic. Okay? So these are the different regions, the different terms for blood flow to particular areas of the body. Alright, so what I want to do now is I want to go over the different parts of the heart and some of the blood vessels that have to do with the heart, and then I want to talk about how blood flows into and out of the heart. Okay? So although I'm going to give you some actual more anatomical pictures of the heart, I'm also going to draw a Dr. Harvey version of the heart. Okay? So here we go. Oops, that is not good. Let's try this again with the darker color so we can actually see it. So here's our little Valentine's heart, you might say. Okay? Try to fill that in so you can see it on the video a little bit better. Okay, so one of the things that you need to know as you're looking at the heart is that you're looking at your patient's heart by their body. So this is going to be your patient's right, this is going to be your patient's left side of the heart. So we're going to say this is the right side, and then this is the left side for your patient. Okay? Now, one other thing that scientists were able to observe is that the heart is actually 4 chambers. So you have the upper right chamber, the upper left, lower right, lower left. Now instead of just calling it upper right or lower right, they gave some names to upper versus lower. So these upper chambers are the atria, and that's plural. If it's singular, you're talking about the atrium. Okay? So you have the right and left atria, and then the lower chambers are the ventricles. So you have the right ventricle, the left ventricle. Okay? Now, when scientists were looking at the heart, they said, well, you know, it's kind of interesting. The heart almost kind of sort of has like a triangle shape. And in a triangle, we know the bottom of the triangle is what we call the base, and the top of the triangle is what we call the apex. So this would be called the apex of the heart, and this region here is the base of the heart. Okay? With me so far? Now, blood, after it's already gone to the body, so it's gone all around the body, it's dropped off its supply of oxygen, it's dropped off its nutrients, it's coming back through the venous system, that venous return. It's going to return to the right side of the heart, and in particular, it's going to return to the right atria of the heart. So if you look at this picture here, you can see here's the heart, and it's sitting in between the lungs here, which you'll be looking at on your pigs. And the heart, as it sits in our thoracic cavity, this cavity here, the heart is pointing towards the left, okay? So that's what we're seeing here. It's pointing to our patient's left. And notice these little things on the outside of the heart. They almost look like sort of Mickey Mouse ears on the outside. These are the atria of the heart. So we have the right atria and the left atria. And then everything else you see pointing towards the left on the bottom, these are the ventricles of the heart. So then when we look at the heart a little closer here, you can see again at the top with this picture, on the right and left side, you have the little ears that are sticking out. These are the atria. And then underneath, looks almost a little different color, definitely a different texture, these are the ventricles. And now you can see the blood vessels also that are entering and leaving the heart. These two on your left-hand side, your patient's right though, these two in blue are the major blood vessels that bring blood back to the heart. So that's what I'm drawing here. These are the two major blood vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart. So this first major blood vessel is called the inferior vena cava. And its job is to bring blood from the upper region of the body, anything above the heart, like the head, the upper arms, back to the heart. This blood vessel here is the inferior vena cava, and it is bringing it's bringing blood from the lower region of the heart. Now notice I've brought this blood in and I've drawn it as blue. We always draw blood as blue when it is deoxygenated blood. Now what this means is this blood is low in oxygen. Okay? It does not mean that the blood has 0 oxygen. It just means that the blood is very low in oxygen because we've already dumped off a supply of oxygen to the tissues. The deoxygenated blood, the blood that's already been dropping off its oxygen to the rest of the tissues of the body, as soon as it comes in through either the superior vena cava, oh, I did that totally wrong, I'm so sorry. I wrote inferior twice, I apologize. This should be superior, excuse me. So that is the superior vena cava, and then from below the body it's coming back via the inferior vena cava. Okay, so we got that one settled, figured out. Now, as soon as it enters the right atrium, this deoxygenated blood is going to move into the ventricle. And that move is simply by gravity, and there is an opening between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And so the blood moves in to the right ventricle and it begins to fill up this right ventricle due to this opening. Now, if you look at the overhead here, you can see this is the right ventricle. And again, here's the superior vena cava coming in, this is the right atrium at the top on the right side of your patient. And the superior vena cava is coming through the right atrium. And the inferior vena cava is coming into the right atrium. And then right in between the atrium and the ventricle, this white object right here, this is that opening that the blood goes through. And this white object is a valve. Now, valves move so that things can move through it and then it can close again. So it can open and then it can close, and in this particular case so that blood can move through. So the valve that's here kind of hangs down naturally into this right ventricle, and the blood is cruising through this opening. The name of this valve is the tricuspid valve. Or sometimes you'll hear people call this the right atrioventricular valve. And so blood goes through, because it's open, it's like my hands, these are the valves that are hanging down into the right ventricle below, and the blood is cruising through simply by gravity from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and we're filling the right ventricle up with blood. Okay? And as that right ventricle fills with blood, the valve is beginning to close. Now, when the valve closes, hanging down below the valve are these little kind of stringy things. So again, if you look at the overhead, you can see the white valve right here between the atria and the ventricle, and then underneath of the valve, there's these little kind of stringy things, okay? And so you have these sort of strings coming off of the valve here, okay? These are the little stringy things hanging off. And these are made out of connective tissue. And then they are attached to, coming out of the muscle of the wall of the heart, there are these little, kind of like little nipples, okay? And they're protruding from the muscle, and these are made out of muscle themselves, okay? These are called papillary muscle. And let me just rewrite that in black. Keep forgetting, can't see red very well. Those are the papillary muscles. And the little strings that are attached to the papillary muscles, these are called the chordae tendineae. Okay? And so those are all the little kind of green looking strings here that are attached to the papillary muscles. And then you have the same thing over here. There's muscle in between here, between the two sections. This is a muscle that goes in between the two sections. And then coming out of this muscle, you have your 3 papillary muscles that are also attaching to your chordae tendineae on the other side. So again, the blood is moving through the opening, through the valve. We call it either a tricuspid valve or a right atrioventricular valve. And the blood is moving from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. And the valve is open and hanging down into the ventricle, and the blood is filling the ventricle up. And now the blood is starting to push up on the valve, and the valve is starting to slowly close. Coming off the valve and attaching to the papillary muscles are the chordae tendineae, those little string-like things. Now, as soon as this ventricle fills up with blood, okay, the valve is going to completely shut. And the blood has to be ejected, removed from this right ventricle. And so there is another very large blood vessel that we find in the right ventricle. And this super large blood vessel goes up through the heart and then leaves the heart and then it divides after it leaves the heart and carries blood to the lungs. So we'll say this is the lungs just for the sake of drawing. We have lungs on the right side, lungs on the left side, and you have this large vessel which is going to take the deoxygenated blood that has come into the ventricle and filled up the ventricle, and it's going to move that deoxygenated blood out of the heart and into the lungs so we can pick up oxygen. Or remember, this is the pulmonary circulation or the pulmonary circuit. Depends on who you talk to. So again, just to go over this one more time more completely. Blood is coming in to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava. This is deoxygenated blood. And the blood is going right down into the right ventricle from the right atrium. And the right ventricle is filling up with blood, and the valve is beginning to close. And eventually the ventricle will fill up with enough blood that the valve will completely close. It'll snap shut. And then we start to see the muscle of the of the right ventricle. That muscle will start to contract. Now, the muscle of the heart, this muscle here, is called the myocardial muscle. Okay, so this is the muscle that makes up the whole exterior of the heart. This is the myocardial muscle. And that muscle is going to squeeze from the apex up towards the base of the heart. It just starts to squeeze upward. Now, it doesn't keep going all the way up. It only goes to the end of the ventricles here. It squeezes in an upward fashion so that we can push the blood out of this very large vessel and into the lungs. Now, this vessel, it is called the pulmonary trunk, as it is still inside the heart. But when it leaves the heart, this vessel is now called the pulmonary arteries. So you have a right pulmonary artery going to the right lung, and you have a left pulmonary artery going to the left lung to pick up oxygen in the blood. So the whole idea of the right side of the heart is to receive deoxygenated blood from the body, and then to pump that blood from the heart to the lungs so it can pick up oxygen. Now, as soon as the blood moves through the lungs, it's going to go now back to the left side of the heart. So you have blood vessels coming from the left side of the heart, or excuse me, the left side of the lungs. And there's 2 from the left lung. And then you also have 2 that are coming from the right lung. So this blood that is coming back to the heart is now blood that we would say is oxygenated. This blood has picked up plenty of oxygen from the lungs on the right and the left side. And we have plenty of oxygen that's moving back to the left side of the heart. So that on the left side, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be supplying the rest of the body now with this oxygenated blood. However, first, the oxygenated blood has to be able to move into the left ventricle. And so simply by gravity, this oxygenated blood is moving down through the opening, just like we have on the right side, on the left side. And it's beginning to fill up this left ventricle. Now we have pretty much the same setup on the left side that we did on the right. We also have a valve right here, that the blood moving down by gravity causes the valve to swing open. And this valve, since it's on the left side, it has a different name. We call this the bicuspid valve. Or it could be called the left atrioventricular valve. Or this one actually has a third name. The right side doesn't get 3 names, but the left side does. Or, more often, you might hear it called the mitral valve. So, you can use any of those names for the valve on the left side of the heart. So the blood is cruising through there, and again, you have this similar setup. You have the papillary muscles here. Same thing over here. We've got papillary muscles. And then we have the chordae tendineae, which are attached to the underside of the valve. So same thing that we have on the right side of the heart. Now, one of the things about the left side versus the right is that the left side, if you look at the muscle of the heart, the left side has much thicker muscle. Much thicker muscle. And again, this is the myocardium. Or the myocardial muscle. But left side has much thicker muscle than right side. And the reason for that is because we're going to see that the left side pumps the blood out to the entire body, not just out to the lungs. So the right side doesn't have to squeeze too hard. It doesn't have to have a lot of muscle because it's only pumping to the lungs, which are right next door. But the left side, as we're going to talk about in a minute, has to have much bigger squeeze because this is the side of the pump that pumps the blood around the body through all those arteries, arterioles, capillaries. Okay? So we have a much thicker muscle mass on the left side than on the right side. Now again, the oxygenated blood is going down into the ventricle, the valve is open. But as that ventricle is filling up with blood, the valve is slowly beginning to shut. And eventually the valve will snap shut. And once that valve snaps shut, we're going to have a similar thing again occur. The muscle of the heart, that myocardium or myocardial muscle, is going to start contracting upward. And the reason it's contracting upward is because, again, we have a very large vessel here that is going to take the blood out of the heart and then into the rest of the body, or what we already talked about, the systemic circulation. So this large vessel is going to carry the oxygenated blood out to the body. And so this blood is going to then move up through this vessel and out to the body to provide oxygen. And this vessel is called the aorta. Again, remember that's the largest artery in the human body. Now, just so that you know, I am going to provide you with a study guide that has a picture of the heart on it, and you are going to have to label all the parts that you see in this heart. And then you're going to have to be able to trace blood flow through the heart. Now there are also two small valves that are found in the pulmonary trunk is one, and in the aorta is another. This is called the aortic valve. And then this one, obviously, is called the pulmonary valve. So the valve in the pulmonary trunk, we just call it the pulmonary valve. And the valve in the aorta, we call it the aortic valve. Now again, if you take a minute and look at the overhead here, you can see on the right side of the heart, which would be your left side as you're looking at it, we have a large vessel coming out of the right atrium. This is the pulmonary trunk. And notice right here, these two little kind of half-moon looking things, this is the pulmonary valve. And since it's a half moon, sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as a semi-lunar or half-moon valve. Now, as blood goes rushing up this valve, or up the pulmonary trunk, and hits this kind of half-moon valve, the blood coming upward will cause the valve to pop open. Now, once the blood moves by, a little bit of blood will trickle back down and eventually cause the valve to snap shut. Same thing happens here in the aorta. As the blood cruises up out of the heart through the aorta, this semilunar valve will pop open. And then when a little bit of blood trickles back down, because not every ounce of blood can get out of the aorta, some of it will end up coming back through, it'll snap the valve shut. So remember I told you, as blood is coming into the right atrium, the valve is, or through the right atrium into the right ventricle, the valve is slowly shutting, and then when it finally fills up completely in the right ventricle, the valve will snap shut. Same thing happens on the left side. as blood is coming through the valve into the left ventricle, the blood is slowly filling this ventricle up until the valve gets pushed up, and then it will snap shut. So you've got this snapping shut of both of these valves, the right and the left atrioventricular valve. Now, that's important. So let's go through all of this blood flow of the heart one more time, and then I'll tell you why the valve snapping shut is so important. Now, one of the things that I've done so far is I've talked to you about blood flow through the right side and through the left side. So I kind of sort of made it sound like blood is flowing through the right first and then the left, and they're not working together, but they are. And that's really important for you to understand. So how I want to go through this is how it really flows through the heart. So blood is coming in through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium of the heart at the same time that blood is coming from the lungs through those pulmonary veins. And I just realized I forgot to mark those for you. I'm sorry. These vessels here, these are the pulmonary veins. And that's the same thing over here coming from the right side. These are the pulmonary veins. So you have two pulmonary veins from the right lung going to the left atrium, and two pulmonary veins from the left lung going to the left atrium. So let me see if I can start this again, okay? So we have blood coming from the superior and inferior vena cava to the right atrium of the heart. At the same time, blood is coming from the pulmonary veins to the left atrium of the heart. Same time, same rate, same amount of blood going to the right atrium and the left atrium. And both of the valves are open. So you have the right atrioventricular or the tricuspid valve open, the bicuspid valve or the left AV valve is open. And so blood is just coming from the right and left atrium down into the ventricles. And the ventricles are filling up with blood at the same time, same rate, same amount. Which also means that both valves are slowly closing at the same time until they both snap shut at the same time. Then we see the muscle of the heart, both on the right and the left side, squeezing upward from the apex towards the base, pushing the blood up the pulmonary trunk and up the aorta at the same time. Which means both the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve pop open at the same time. And little bits of blood come back down the pulmonary trunk and back down the aorta at the same time so that both valves close or snap shut at the same time. And that blood is going out to the lungs or out to the body. And then you start the cycle over, what we would call the cardiac cycle. That's what we just went through. Now that snapping shut of these first two valves, the AV valves, that actually is what you hear when you're listening to your heart sound. You hear two sounds. You should hear like boom, boom, or in your book they call it lub, dub. I don't know where they got that from, but whatever. So that boom, boom, or that lub, dub sound, okay? The first boom, or the lub, are the two atrioventricular valves snapping shut together. The second boom, or the dub, are the two semilunar valves, pulmonary aortic, snapping shut together. So when you're working in a clinical situation and you're listening to somebody's heartbeat, you're listening for those two sounds, but really what you're listening for is the valves snapping shut. Are they snapping shut together? Are they snapping shut in the right pattern? And how many times do you hear them snapping shut per minute? So what if instead of that boom boom or that lub dub you might hear when you're listening with a stethoscope, what if you hear this? Bubba bubba boom, bubba bubba boom, bubba bubba boom, bubba bubba boom, instead of just boom boom. Well, what that is that is all 4 of your valves snapping shut separately. And so what happens is if they're all opening and shutting at a different time, blood is stopping and starting as it goes through the heart. You don't get this smooth flow through the heart. Everything is stopping and starting. And one of the big deals is that you can get blood clots. If blood flow stops long enough, it can, excuse me, it can actually start to clot. And that's a big problem. You don't want blood clots in the heart. Of course, the other problem is, too, if you don't have smooth flow and it's stopping and starting, you don't have good blood flow to the rest of the body. And, of course, now that means you could also get blood clots. So this is a huge, huge deal. Any questions? Okay, so yes, a mitral valve prolapse. Okay, so what's a mitral valve prolapse? This is the same thing you might hear called regurgitation. This is the same thing as a heart murmur. So what this means is the mitral valve, when it shuts, okay, the whole idea is it needs to stay shut. And we didn't really talk about what do these papillary muscles, what do these chordae tendineae do, but their job is once the valve shuts, they pull on the valve, and they actually pull the valve downward. Because at the same time they're pulling the valve down, the muscle or the myocardium of the heart is pushing blood up. So the chordae tendineae and the pulmonary muscles, they contract and pull the valve down as the blood, the pressure from the blood pushes the valve up. And that keeps the valve closed. But in a heart murmur or mitral valve prolapse or regurgitation, what happens is those chordae tendineae or those papillary muscles, there's something wrong with them, typically. Or maybe there's something even wrong with the valve. Maybe it's malformed or something like that. And so the valve isn't pulled down while the blood is pushing up. So instead, when the blood starts to push up, the valve blows back. So what would happen if this valve blows back? Well, instead of blood going all up the aorta like it's supposed to and now out to the body, maybe some of it gets up the aorta, but a lot of it will go back to the left atrium. And if that blood just regurgitates or goes back to the left atrium, then you don't get as much blood going out to the body, which means also I don't get as much oxygen to my tissues, which, by the way, one of the #1 complaints of people who have a heart murmur is fatigue, because they don't have enough oxygen, they can't make enough ATP, they feel tired all the time. And so that's what a prolapse is, that's what a heart murmur is. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I just wanted to show you this picture because I forgot to show this to you. This is just showing you the muscle or the myocardium of the heart where there's a smaller amount in the right ventricle compared to the left ventricle, much larger. And you'll see that when you look at hearts in lab as well. Here is a picture of clogging of the arteries. And you can see there's blood clots, that kind of thing that can occur. And now look what happens to the lumen of the artery. There's not as much blood can get through here when the artery clogs. And then you can also get blood clots, like look at this one here on the right side. There's a huge blood clot there, and so there's a teeny tiny lumen. Not much blood can go through that small opening, which means you don't get a lot of circulation to the tissues. And then if that is a blood vessel that is feeding the heart, like you can see these blood vessels here, that's part of the coronary arteries or coronary circulation, then the heart muscle doesn't get as much oxygen, doesn't get as much nutrients, and can die. And when heart muscle dies, this is what we call heart attack. And so here's a picture showing you a pretty dang unhealthy heart. That muscle should be nice and pinkish red, and it's really, really damaged. Now when they try to get this clogging, or we call it plaque in the arteries, this buildup, sometimes what they'll do is put in what they call a stent, and at the end of the stent there is a balloon. And they'll blow this balloon up, and you can see what the balloon does is it compresses all this plaque or clogging, and the hope is it helps to hold the artery open. Now here's the big problem. If you have this plaque still in the artery, it is much more likely that you'll build up more if you don't change your lifestyle. More exercise, eating correctly, all that kind of good stuff helps to decrease the plaque in the artery. Okay, so big problem, and this is what they typically call arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis. All right, any other questions? Okay, well that's the end of the cardiovascular section.